My name is Maren Whitlock. I am 33 years old, and I coordinate emergency transfers at a community hospital in Pennsylvania. I spend my nights finding beds for people who cannot breathe. I find ambulances for families already panicking in hallways and insurance answers for elderly patients who thought Medicare would be simpler than this. I am good in a crisis. That is what everyone says. Calm voice. Clean paperwork. No wasted motion. On Mother's Day, I drove 3 hours to my parents' brick ranch in Mechanicsburg. Hydrangeas wrapped in brown paper sat on the passenger seat, and a photo album I had made the week before rested in the back. I told myself I was not going there for a fight. I was going there for one quiet answer from my brother Nolan about the $18,750 loan he had opened under my name. My mother set the hydrangeas on the counter, without unwrapping them. We were halfway through Beverly's chicken casserole when I asked him. Low voice. No accusation. Just, your deadline was last Sunday, Nolan. Where are we? My mother's fork stopped first. My father set his iced tea down so hard it jumped against the glass. Darlene Moss from church, who had no reason to be at our family table except that my mother liked witnesses, looked at me like I had cursed in a sanctuary. A good daughter doesn't bring up money on Mother's Day, she said. I looked at my brother. He looked at his plate. Then my father said, "We wish we'd never had a daughter like you." My mother did not correct him. She nodded once and whispered, "So do I." For a second, nobody moved. Tessa's hand went cold beside mine. The clock over the stove ticked twice. I stood up, folded my napkin, corners even. Because some part of me still needed one thing in that room to stay in order. Then live like you don't, I said. 12 minutes after I left, my phone buzzed. Bring our car back, or your father is calling the police. I opened the glove box, looked at the registration with my name on every line, and typed back, "Go ahead." What my parents did not understand was that calling the police would not make the car theirs. It would make everything they had been pretending for 8 years finally ask for proof. Get comfortable, because this story is about to take a turn you won't expect. Skip the phone games, and keep reading the story. We're not doing polls here, the story matters more. If you enjoy these, don't worry about links, just keep reading the rest of my story. Now get comfortable, because today's story takes a turn you won't expect. Let's begin. Before I tell you what those officers asked my parents on the porch, you need to understand what I do for a living, because it matters. My job does not look dramatic from the outside. I sit under fluorescent lights at Street Bridget's Community Hospital with 3 monitors, 2 phones, and a list of people whose families think the system has forgotten them. Most nights, I am not saving anyone with my hands. I am saving them with hold music, authorization numbers, and the stubborn refusal to hang up first. I work in the narrow space between emergency and aftermath. Stroke patients who need neurobeds. Grandfathers with broken hips waiting for rehab placement. Widows on oxygen whose adult children are whispering in the hallway because nobody knows what Medicare will actually cover. Half my calls come from sons and daughters who sound scared, tired, and ashamed that they do not know what comes next. I know that sound. I used to think I only recognized it from work. At the hospital, useful means competent. Useful means trusted. Useful means someone's mother does not spend 12 hours on a hallway gurney because I found a transport crew before the weather closed the interstate. People do not always remember my name, but eventually someone says thank you. Sometimes it is a nurse with coffee gone cold in her hand. Sometimes it is a daughter crying into the phone from 3 states away. That was enough to keep me going for years. Then there was my other life, the one waiting in Mechanicsburg, where useful meant something different. My family did not call when something good happened. They did not call to ask whether I had eaten after a double shift, or whether my back hurt from sitting in the same chair for 14 hours. They called when something broke. The furnace. My father's prescription card. Nolan's truck. My mother's checking account. A bill from a specialist Russell swore Medicare should have covered. In my parents' house, I was not a daughter with a birthday, a bad day, or a body that got tired under fluorescent lights. I was the after-hours number. I was the backup plan. I was the quiet account they reached for when panic had already done its work. And the worst part is, for a long time, I liked being necessary. When my mother said, "Mare, I don't know what we'd do without you," something small and hungry in me stood up straighter. It took me years to hear what she was really saying. Not, "I see you." Not, "Thank you." Not, "How are you holding up?" Just, "Don't stop." There is a difference between being loved and being necessary. I learned that difference, one transfer request, one utility bill, one family emergency at a time. And if I am honest, that education started in the fall of 2015, when my father hurt his back. My mother called me close to midnight, and I sent the first $600 before I checked whether I had enough left to buy groceries for myself. The first $600 left my account at 12:18 a.m. I remember because I was sitting on the kitchen floor of my apartment in Harrisburg, still wearing my hospital badge, eating crackers straight from the sleeve because I had missed dinner again. My mother had called crying so hard I could barely understand her. Russell's back injury was worse than they thought. The insurance paperwork was a mess. The electric bill was late. Nolan was between jobs again, which was a phrase my family used the way other people used weather reports. I did not ask why Nolan could not help. I did not ask why my parents had no savings. I did not ask why the emergency had found me before it found anyone else. I opened my banking app and sent the money. When the confirmation screen came up, my mother breathed out like I had lifted a car off her chest. "God knew we could count on you, Mare," she said. I went to bed with my stomach still empty enough to ache, but with those words beside me like a blanket. After that, the calls got easier for them to make. 400 for prescriptions, 900 for Nolan's truck insurance because he needed transportation to look for work, 1,200 when the heating bill jumped in January, 2,700 for a procedure Russell said would get him moving again, 800 when Nolan's temporary setback became another month on my parents' couch. Nobody called any of it borrowing. Borrowing has a return date. In my family, money I sent simply became proof that I could send more. I was not making much then. I worked night shifts and packed leftovers in plastic containers. I bought my work shoes from the clearance rack, even though I spent 10 hours a day walking hospital floors. I postponed a dental appointment because my father needed a specialist copay. I kept driving my old sedan, with the check engine light glowing, like a warning I had trained myself not to read. Every time I thought about saying no, Beverly's voice would soften. "You're the steady one," she would say. "That's what daughters do." The Christmas that should have taught me came 2 years later. I finished a 14-hour shift and drove to Mechanicsburg with gifts in the trunk. There was no room for me in the house I had been helping to keep warm. Nolan had the couch. My parents had filled the spare room with donation boxes. Beverly said she was sorting after the holidays. Half of them already had dust on the lids. I slept in the back seat. I woke every hour to run the heat for 10 minutes while frost gathered along the windshield. In the morning, my mother knocked on the glass and handed me coffee in a travel mug. Nolan was still asleep inside, 10 feet from the Christmas tree. I scraped ice from the inside of my windshield with an old rewards card. Before I could thank her, Beverly asked if I could send 300 more. Groceries had run higher than expected. I sent it before the coffee cooled. And for years, I told myself that was love. By 2018, I had become good at surviving my own generosity. That sounds dramatic, until you see how ordinary it looked. I paid one bill, then another. I skipped one appointment, then another. I told myself the old sedan would last one more winter, then one more after that. Meanwhile, my parents' rental house in Mechanicsburg kept aging around them. The porch boards softened. The basement took water after heavy rain. The landlord stopped fixing things quickly, then stopped fixing them at all. That spring, Beverly called me at 10:06 p.m., which was early for a family emergency. Her voice had that thin, frightened edge I had learned to answer before the second ring. The landlord was selling. They had 60 days to leave. Russell's back could not handle a second-floor apartment. Nolan had quit another delivery route and was calling it a reset. Every sentence landed where it always landed, in my lap. My mother did not ask me to buy them a house. She was too smart for that. She just cried until I named the solution myself. I found the brick ranch on Maple Hollow Road 3 weeks later. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom with yellow tile from another decade, a small basement that smelled like concrete and laundry soap, a white fence leaning just enough to need work, but not enough to scare a lender. Out front, beside the steps, there was a half-dead hydrangea bush with brown flowers still clinging to it from the year before. The realtor called it charming. I called it affordable, which is what adults say when they are already surrendering. The purchase price was $238,000. The mortgage came to $1,375 a month. That was before utilities, insurance, taxes, and all the little expenses houses hide until you own them. The bank approved me by a margin so thin it felt less like permission and more like a warning. At closing, I signed my name until my wrist ached. Maren Elise Whitlock. Maren Elise Whitlock. Maren Elise Whitlock. Every page said the same thing in different legal language. Owner, borrower, responsible party. I told them the arrangement clearly. They could live there while Russell recovered and while they got back on their feet. We would revisit it when things stabilized. Beverly held both of my hands in that empty kitchen and cried so hard her mascara gathered under her eyes. Russell shook my hand like we were 2 men finalizing a business deal. For one bright, foolish second, I thought they understood what this cost me. Then Beverly looked around the kitchen, touched the counter, and whispered, "Finally. A home of our own." She said it softly, like a prayer, and everyone in the room treated it like one. I should have corrected her. I know that now. I should have said, "No, Mom, it's my house, and I'm letting you live here." I should have made the sentence plain enough to survive church gossip, neighbor talk, and Nolan's version of every story. But Darlene Moss had arrived with a casserole dish and a voice full of blessing. Darlene was the kind of woman who could turn a misunderstanding into a testimony by Sunday. "Beverly," Darlene said, setting the dish on my counter, "the Lord finally gave you your house." My mother smiled through fresh tears. Russell nodded. I stood there with the keys still warm in my palm and said nothing. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes, silence is a signature you do not realize you are giving. Within 6 months, the women from church were calling it Beverly's Blessing House. By Christmas, the neighbors waved at Russell when he mowed the lawn and said he had done well for himself after the injury. Every month, the mortgage came out of my account in Harrisburg. Every month, the story in Mechanicsburg grew stronger without me. I paid the property taxes. Beverly chose curtains. I paid the insurance. Russell planted tomatoes by the fence. I replaced the water heater. Darlene organized a prayer circle in Beverly's kitchen. Only the county recorder and my bank seemed to remember whose name held the roof up. I did not know then that a house can become stolen long before anyone changes the deed. Sometimes all it takes is a family willing to repeat a story, and one tired daughter too hungry for belonging to interrupt them. I should have learned from the house. I didn't. By then, my family had already learned that if they used something of mine long enough, they could start calling it ours without lowering their voices. The house had taught them repetition worked. The curtains, the tomatoes, the church ladies, all of it had helped turn my name on a deed into their story at Sunday coffee. So when the Subaru came along, I should have protected it from the beginning. Instead, I made the old mistake again. I trusted people who treated trust like a storage unit. I bought the gray Subaru Outback in 2024. One winter storm had left me sitting sideways on I-83 inches, my old sedan, hazard lights blinking and hands shaking on the wheel. I had worked 16 hours that day, arranging transfers for patients whose families begged us not to send them anywhere in the snow. Then I nearly slid into a guardrail trying to get home. 2 weeks later, I signed the papers on the Subaru, not for my parents, not for Nolan, not for a crisis. For me, that mattered more than I admitted at the time. I chose the heated seats because my back hurt after long shifts. I chose all-wheel drive because Pennsylvania winter does not care how responsible you are. I chose the gray because it looked quiet, practical, invisible in the way I had trained myself to be. When the salesman handed me the keys, he said, "Enjoy it." I remember standing in the parking lot and realizing I did not know how to enjoy something without first explaining why I deserved it. In early 2025, the hospital sent me to Denver for a 5-month regional emergency preparedness training program. I did what I thought was sensible. I left the Subaru in the garage at Maple Hollow Road because my apartment complex had open parking. I did not want it sitting there through spring storms and summer heat. I gave Russell one instruction: start it once a week. Don't drive it unless there's an emergency. He nodded like a man accepting a sacred duty. Beverly said, "Of course, honey. We'll take care of it." When I came back, the odometer had 6,700 extra miles on it. I sat in the driver's seat, with my suitcase still on the driveway. I stared at the number until it stopped looking like a number and started looking like a confession. The seat had been pushed all the way back. There was a stale cigarette smell in the fabric, though no one in my family admitted to smoking. The radio presets were changed. A little silver cross hung from the rearview mirror. Under the passenger seat, I found an energy drink can and a receipt from Halvorsen Auto. Nolan was in the garage when I held up the receipt. His handwriting was on the bottom. Brent Halvorsen's initials sat beside a charge I had never approved. Nolan wiped his hands on a rag like this was a conversation between mechanics, not a woman and the brother who had been driving her car for months. "Relax, Mare," he said. "It's an Outback. It's made to be driven." Russell said my mother needed it for appointments. Beverly said it had been helpful for errands. Every explanation had just enough reason in it to make me sound unreasonable if I raised my voice. Then I heard my mother at the fence that afternoon, talking to Mrs. Larkin from next door. Her voice was light, almost proud. "Maren came by to pick up our Subaru for a few days," she said. "Our Subaru. Not my car, not Maren's car. Ours." The word moved through me slowly, like cold water under a locked door. I had seen them do it with a house. Now they were doing it with the only thing I had bought, simply because I needed it. I did not confront her at the fence. I did not correct Mrs. Larkin. I drove to a pharmacy parking lot 3 miles away, opened the glove box, and spread the paperwork across the passenger seat. Registration, my name. Insurance, my name. Loan documents, my name. Address in Harrisburg, not Mechanicsburg. I photographed every page and uploaded the copies to a folder. I ordered a replacement title to be sent directly to my apartment. Then I called a locksmith and had the spare key situation changed before the end of the week. After that, I kept the Subaru in Harrisburg. My parents treated that less like a boundary and more like a theft. Beverly said I had embarrassed her in front of the neighbors. Russell said I was letting paperwork make me cold. Nolan said I was acting like a rich woman over a car that mostly sat unused during my shifts anyway. I did not argue. I had spent enough years in hospitals to know that records matter most when everyone starts telling a different version of what happened. At the time, it felt excessive, paranoid, even. That is the word families like mine use when you stop trusting their memory. I did not know Mother's Day would turn those papers into a shield. I only knew that the steering wheel no longer smelled like mine, and I was tired of losing things one family nickname at a time. The next time they called it theirs, they would do it in front of a police officer. 6 weeks before Mother's Day, the hospital found the thing I had been too tired to imagine. It came through as a routine internal notice from employee compliance, the kind of message most people ignore until the subject line turns their hands cold. A delinquent personal loan had appeared under my Social Security number, $18,750, opened online. 9 months old. Mailing address listed as the house on Maple Hollow Road. I read the notice twice in a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and burnt coffee. Anika Sloan from social work sat across from me, We had spent enough overnight shifts solving impossible discharges to skip small talk. She was 29, sharp-eyed, and kind in the careful way hospital people become when they know bad news is about to cost someone more than sleep. "Maren," she said softly, "with your access to protected patient information, they're going to want a clean paper trail." That was the sentence that made it real. This was not just money, it was my name, my job, my access badge, the life I had built one double shift at a time. I called the lender on my lunch break and froze what could be frozen. I asked for the full transaction history. The fraud representative spoke in that polished voice people use when they are reading from a screen, the kind meant to keep the caller calm. She said they would need a police report, an identity theft affidavit, and proof of where I had been when the account was opened. The charge history arrived that evening. I sat in my car outside the hospital and read it line by line while the automatic doors opened and shut behind me. Truck repairs, a sports betting payment, 2 cash advances, a charge at Halvorsen Auto, another at a casino outside York. The first withdrawal happened on a Tuesday afternoon. My badge record showed me inside street. Bridget's for a 12-hour shift, coordinating a nursing home evacuation after a power outage. I knew before I reached the bottom of the page. Nolan's truck. Nolan's habits. Nolan's favorite garage. Nolan's way of treating consequences like weather that would pass if he waited indoors long enough. That Saturday, I drove to Mechanicsburg with a folder on the passenger seat and a calm so tight it felt borrowed. I put the transaction history on the kitchen table and asked him one question. "Did you open this?" He went through the whole performance. Confusion first, then insult, then a loud, wounded speech about how I always assumed the worst of him. Beverly stood behind his chair with one hand on his shoulder. Russell leaned against the counter and said, "Let's not turn this into something ugly." Then Nolan looked at the paper, shrugged, and said, "I was going to pay it before you ever saw it." I asked him, "With what money?" His mouth tightened. "You work at a hospital, Mare. Don't act like this ruins you." That was the moment something in me stepped back. Not broke. Not yet. Just stepped back far enough to see the room clearly. My brother had used my name, risked my job, and still thought the real injury was me noticing. I wrote an agreement in plain English. Nolan admitted the loan. Nolan owed $18,750. Nolan had 21 days to make the first payment, or I would file a police report. He signed it with my pen, smirking like paperwork was another thing this family could outwait. The deadline was Sunday, May 3rd. That day passed quietly, which somehow felt worse than a fight. No payment, no call, no apology, and 1 week later, I still bought hydrangeas for Mother's Day because hope can make an intelligent woman do very stupid things. On Mother's Day, I got up before sunrise and stood in my apartment kitchen with the hydrangeas still in their grocery store sleeve. I had bought them the night before from a display near the pharmacy counter. They were blue, heavy-headed, and already beginning to bruise at the edges. My mother loved hydrangeas when I was little, or maybe I loved the version of her who loved them. Sometimes, memory is less a photograph than a receipt you keep hoping someone will honor. I drove 40 minutes to Mechanicsburg with the flowers on the passenger seat and the photo album in the back. It was not a long drive on a map. That morning, it felt like crossing back into a life I had spent years trying to outgrow. I was not going to mention the police. I was not going to threaten Nolan. I had one sentence prepared, sanded smooth by every mile of highway. "Your deadline was last Sunday. Where are we?" Tessa met me halfway up the walk. She was 20, thin from college cafeteria, food, and stress, with her hair twisted into a knot that was already falling apart. She hugged me hard and whispered, "I'm glad you came, Aunt Mare." I nearly lost my nerve right there. Inside, Beverly took the hydrangeas, smiled for Darlene Moss, and laid them on the counter without unwrapping them. Russell sat at the head of the table. Nolan was already in his chair, thumbs moving under the table like his phone might rescue him. Dinner moved on the strength of other people's voices. Darlene talked about a church fundraiser. Russell complained about a specialist who didn't understand real pain. Beverly praised Nolan for helping with the garage. I watched my brother nod like a man receiving credit for not stealing anything that week. The chicken casserole sat heavy and pale in the center of the table. I waited until the plates slowed, until Tessa's knee stopped bouncing beside mine, until there was no kind way left to delay the truth. I looked at Nolan and kept my voice low. Your 21 days ended last Sunday. Where are we? No one asked what I meant. That was the first answer. Beverly's face folded before Nolan even opened his mouth. Not today, she said. Please, Maren, not today. He used my name, I said. Russell's glass hit the table. He made a mistake. He committed a crime. Darlene leaned forward, soft and poisonous. A good daughter doesn't bring up money on Mother's Day. Nolan stared at his plate. And then my father looked at me with a kind of disgust I'd never seen him wear in daylight. We wish we'd never had a daughter like you. My mother did not gasp. She did not tell him to stop. She looked at me with wet eyes and said, clear enough for everyone to hear. So do I. The room went still. Tessa's hand found mine under the table, cold as tap water. I could hear the refrigerator hum. I could hear Darlene breathing through her nose. I could hear my own heart, steady and far away, like it belonged to someone watching from a doorway. I stood, folded my napkin, corners even. Then live like you don't, I said. I walked out before any of them could turn my pain into a discussion. 12 minutes later, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. Bring our car back, or your father is calling the police. I looked at the screen until the words stopped hurting and started to mean something. Then I typed 2 words. Go ahead. I did not know yet that those 2 words would bring Sergeant Lowell Keene to my parents' porch. Nor did I know they would make my mother's favorite lie answer a very simple question. I turned the Subaru around at the next gas station. I drove back to Maple Hollow Road with both hands steady on the wheel. Not calm, steady. There is a difference. Calm means nothing is happening inside you. Steady means everything is happening, and you have decided not to let it drive. By the time I reached the neighborhood, the first cruiser was already at the curb. Red and blue light washed over the white fence I had paid to repair 2 summers earlier. Neighbors had begun their careful watching. Curtains lifted just enough to deny it later. Mrs. Larkin stood behind her screen door with one hand at her throat. Beverly was on the porch with Darlene beside her, arms crossed like a woman, waiting for a verdict she had already written. Russell stood near the steps, jaw locked. Nolan hovered by the garage, trying to look uninvolved in a story that had his fingerprints all over it. Sergeant Lowell Keene had already run the plate. I could tell by the way he looked at the Subaru before he looked at my mother. He was a broad man in his late 40s, with tired eyes and the patient posture of someone who had knocked on too many family doors and found the truth behind all the shouting. When I parked across the street, he was holding a small notepad, listening to Beverly explain that her daughter had taken the family car after ruining Mother's Day dinner. I stepped out with my hospital ID, the car registration and insurance card, and a photo of the title on my phone. I did not walk fast. I had learned long ago that moving fast around angry folks makes them think they're winning. Sergeant Keene glanced at my paperwork, then back at my mother. Ma'am, he said, voice even, this vehicle is registered to Maren Whitlock. Which one of you is Maren? Beverly pointed at me like I had disappointed the entire street. That's my daughter. She took it to punish us. Is your name anywhere on the registration? He asked. My mother blinked. Russell shifted his weight. Darlene looked down at her purse. Beverly lifted her chin. In this family, we don't split things with paperwork. There it was. The whole religion, spoken out loud on a Sunday porch. The same rule that had swallowed my money, my house, my car, and almost my name. Everything was family when it belonged to me. Everything became personal property the moment someone else had to be responsible for it. Sergeant Keene did not smile. He just wrote something down, and I loved him a little for that. Nolan chose that moment to step forward. This is harassment, he said. loud enough for the neighbors. She thinks because she works at some hospital, she can come here and threaten everybody with forms. His face was flushed. His hands kept opening and closing. Keen's partner, a younger officer near the second cruiser, asked Nolan for his ID. Nolan laughed once, the wrong kind of laugh, and said he did not see why that was necessary. It turned out to be very necessary. While Sergeant Keen explained to my parents that the Subaru had not been stolen, his partner ran Nolan's name. The radio crackled. The younger officer's expression changed first. Not dramatically. Just enough. There was an unresolved summons tied to an uninsured driving incident and an open inquiry connected to Halverson Auto. Nothing as theatrical as television. No shouting, no running. Just the quiet sound of a system finding a thread and pulling. Nolan's face went slack. Russell looked at me before he looked at his son. "Now look what you did," he said. That was when I understood how deep it went. My parents had called the police on me over a car they did not own. Their son had stepped into his own trouble. And still, somehow, I was the cause. I was the weather, the diagnosis, the unpaid bill, the thing everyone blamed because blaming me was easier than reading the paperwork. Sergeant Keen gave Beverly and Russell a warning about false reporting. He said it carefully, slowly, with Darlene standing close enough to hear every word. If they called again claiming I had stolen my own vehicle, the next conversation would not be as friendly. Beverly's face tightened, but she said nothing. For once, the story had run into a room where her voice was not the final authority. As I walked back to the Subaru, my phone buzzed. "Tessa. I saw everything. They're already saying you brought the police here. I'll tell the truth." I stood beside the driver's door, watching the porch light flicker over the people I had spent years trying to keep safe from consequences. "You don't have to choose sides, kiddo," I typed. Her answer came back before I started the engine. "I'm not choosing sides. I'm choosing what happened." I did not go back inside. There are doors you can walk through 1,000 times and still understand, all at once, that entering again would cost too much. I drove to a motel near Carlisle. The photo album stayed unopened in the back seat, and the hydrangeas were probably wilting on my mother's counter. The clerk handed me a key card without looking up. I remember being grateful for that. Some nights, anonymity feels like mercy. The room smelled like old carpet, lemon cleaner, and air conditioning that had worked too hard for too many summers. I set my purse on the desk, took off my shoes, and opened my laptop. Not because I was brave. Because I did not know what else to do with the amount of truth sitting in my chest. At the hospital, when a situation gets messy, you take inventory, you stop guessing. You count what is actually there. So I counted. Mortgage payments from 2018 to 2026. Property taxes. Home insurance. Utilities I had quietly covered when Beverly said the bill must have gotten lost. Russell's specialist copays. The roof repair. The water heater. Nolan's truck money. Prescriptions. Groceries. Phone lines. Transfers with memo notes so vague, they might as well have said, "Please love me this month." By 1:40 a.m., I had a number, $146,800. I wrote it on the back of an old appointment card from Street. Bridget's because it was the only paper in my purse thick enough not to bend under my hand. I stared at it until the digits stopped looking like money and started looking like years. The $18,750 loan was not even in that total. That belonged in another column, things taken, not given. I expected anger to come first. It did not. Grief came first. It was heavy and embarrassing, like realizing you had been mailing invitations to a house that was never built. I had not been buying medicine, heat, repairs, or second chances. Not really. I had been buying a chair at the table. A daughter-shaped space, they only kept open as long as the payments cleared. My phone lit up close to 2 in the morning. "Tessa again. Grandma is calling everyone. She says you tried to get Dad arrested and stole the car." I typed, "I'm sorry you're in the middle of this." Then I erased it. She had been in the middle long before tonight. We both had. I looked at the card again. $146,800. Pity is real. So is a pattern. That night, for the first time, I decided the pattern needed more of my attention than the apology I still wanted. Monday morning, I drove to the police station with the appointment card still in my wallet. The transaction history was in a folder on the passenger seat. The building smelled like burnt coffee, floor wax, and paper that had been touched by too many worried hands. I sat across from a detective named Ramos. He was not the Ramos from any story I had ever heard. He was a compact man with tired eyes and reading glasses balanced on top of his head. He did not rush me. That helped more than I expected. I filed the identity theft report in my own name and wrote Nolan Whitlock on the line that asked for the suspected person, if known. My hand did not shake until after I finished the last letter. I gave Detective Ramos the lender records, the badge logs from Street, Bridges, and the transaction history. I also handed him the agreement Nolan had signed with my pen. He read that page twice. Then he looked up at me over his glasses. "He signed this?" he asked. I nodded. "That makes things cleaner," he said. Clean was not the word I would have used. Nothing about it felt clean. But it was documented. By then, documented had become the only kind of mercy I trusted. From the parking lot, I called Patrice Leland, a real estate attorney in Harrisburg. Her voicemail sounded more awake than most people I knew. By noon, I was in her office with the deed, mortgage records, tax receipts, insurance statements, and every utility bill I could pull from my accounts. Patrice listened without making the soft pity face people use when they want your pain to hurry. She spread the documents across her desk and tapped the deed once with a red fingernail. "Paper does not care who cried first, Maren," she said. "It cares whose name is on the deed." Then she explained occupants at will, written notice, certified mail, timelines, and the difference between doing something angry and doing something correctly. My parents and Nolan had no lease. They had no rent history. They had a story. I had ownership. The clean way was a 45-day notice to vacate. That afternoon, I began decommissioning the family emergency line one account at a time. The phone plan became one line. Mine. The utility accounts were switched to require the occupants to establish service in their own names. Beverly's card attached to my credit account was closed. The pharmacy auto pay I had kept just in case was canceled. Nolan's gas money transfer, so old, it felt like furniture in my banking app, disappeared with 2 taps. I expected those taps to feel cruel. Mostly, they felt overdue. I did not stop paying the mortgage. That surprises people who think boundaries are the same thing as bonfires. The house was mine. The credit was mine. Burning it down financially to punish them would have been another way of letting them control the cost of my life. So I paid the mortgage, sent the notices, and kept copies of everything. Darlene started calling women from church before the certified mail cards even came back. Brent Halverson left one message, warning me not to drag his garage into a family misunderstanding. I forwarded Brent's message to Patrice. I did not answer Darlene. I had spent too many years trying to correct stories in rooms where nobody cared about proof. This time, I was not taking the argument to a kitchen table, a church hallway, or a porch full of neighbors. I was taking it to the only place my mother's version of love had never been able to survive for long. The record. 2 weeks after the notices went out, my mother left a voicemail while I was finishing a discharge call at work. I watched her name glow on my screen until it stopped ringing. The message was 11 seconds long. "Mare, it's Mom. Come to dinner Sunday. Just us. I'll make chicken casserole. No crying, no scripture, no Darlene in the background. Just Mare." The small version of my name my father used before the house became a ledger, and love became something with due dates. I played it 3 times in the hospital stairwell, then called Celia Brandt. Celia had been a nurse longer than I had been alive, in some ways that mattered. She listened without interrupting, and when the voicemail ended, she asked, "When you walk back out of that house, What do you want to be true? I almost said I wanted closure. That would have sounded grown. The real answer was smaller and more humiliating. I wanted my parents to be sorry. I wanted the casserole to mean they missed me. Sunday evening, I parked in front of Maple Hollow Road and sat there until the porch light flickered on. Boxes lined the hallway inside, taped and labeled in Beverly's careful church handwriting. The house smelled like cream soup, baked chicken, and the childhood I still hated myself for wanting back. Russell stood when I entered. Beverly served me first. For 15 minutes. They were gentle in the way people are gentle when they are carrying something sharp under the table. Then Beverly folded her hands and said, "I said a sinful thing on Mother's Day." Russell looked at his plate. "You carried more than you should have," he added. My throat tightened so fast I had to set my fork down. These were the words I had built whole imaginary rooms around. Beverly's eyes filled. "We were proud of you, Mare. We just didn't know how to say it." And for one dangerous second, I believed dinner had come without a bill. Then my mother reached beside her chair and slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the police report and the 45-day notice. Detective Ramos's number was written across the top in her neat cursive. "Call him Monday," she said softly. "Tell him this was a misunderstanding. Tear up that awful notice. Then we can be a family again." There it was, the price tag sitting where the apology should have been. My fingers touched the appointment card in my wallet, the one with $146,800 written on the back. I had thought about placing it between us, making them look at what love had cost me. But if I did that, we would only be haggling. So I left it there and said, "No." Russell's chair scraped back. "If you walk out," he said, "don't ever call us your parents again." I stood carefully. "You said you wished you never had a daughter like me," I said. "I'm finally respecting that." Then I walked out before the casserole went cold. The next 30 days moved, the way paperwork always moves, slowly enough to make you doubt it, and then all at once. Nolan took a restitution agreement before the summer ended. He did not go to prison. That disappointed the relatives, who had been calling me cruel, and then seemed disappointed again when I was relieved. I never wanted my brother in a cell. I wanted my name back. I wanted a judge to say, in a voice nobody at our table could interrupt, that what happened to me had actually happened. Brent Halverson stopped leaving messages after Patrice sent one letter on firm letterhead. Darlene's version of the story kept traveling through church. Public records travel too. They do not need coffee or permission. Someone found the deed. Someone found the tax history. Someone found the sale records showing my name where Beverly had spent years placing hers. For the first time, my mother's story had to stand beside documents. It looked smaller there. Russell and Beverly moved into a small duplex near the church. Not the street, not a shelter, not the disaster they had promised. Everyone I was creating, just a duplex, with beige siding and 2 bedrooms. The utility bills arrived in their own names. Nolan rented a room near the warehouse, where he had finally taken regular shifts. Nobody vanished. Nobody froze. Nobody was destroyed. They were simply handed back the weight they had trained me to carry. I did not go to Maple Hollow Road on moving day. Some victories are healthier when you do not stand there watching them happen. Tessa sent one picture after the last box left. The living room was empty, sunlight lying across the floor where Beverly's couch had been. The photo album I made for Mother's Day sat in a donation box. Tessa took it to her dorm. "It belongs with someone who knows what it is," she texted. The house sold in September for $319,000. After the mortgage cleared, I bought a small cottage outside Carlisle with a narrow porch and enough dirt for hydrangeas. The day the hardware store clerk cut my new key, I held it in my palm, longer than necessary. Cheap brass, sharp teeth, mine. Next to the Subaru key, it looked like proof. A life could be returned to its owner, one small metal thing at a time. The next Mother's Day, I did not drive to Mechanicsburg. Tessa came to me with a chicken casserole she had made in her apartment oven. It was dry at the edges and underseasoned in the middle. I ate 2 helpings because there was no envelope beside the plate. After dinner, we planted hydrangeas by the porch. My phone stayed quiet all afternoon. For once, quiet did not feel like punishment. It felt like peace. Love you have to keep paying for is not love. It is a bill. And that year, I finally stopped renewing it. The lesson I took from all of this is not that family is bad. It is not that helping people makes you weak. I still believe helping is one of the most sacred things a person can do. A warm meal, a paid bill during a hard month, a ride to the doctor, a room offered when someone has nowhere else to go, those things can be love. But they stop being love when they are demanded instead of received. They stop being love when gratitude disappears and expectation takes its place. For years, I thought endurance was the same as loyalty. I believed that if I could carry one more bill, forgive one more insult, and answer one more late-night call, then eventually my parents would finally see me. Not as the steady one. Not as the useful one. Not as the daughter with the bank account and the paperwork and the car keys. Just me. But love that only reaches for you when it needs something is not love. It is a habit. And sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that people can depend on you without valuing you. They can call you family and still treat your peace like an unpaid balance. Healing did not begin when the house sold or when Nolan signed the restitution agreement. Healing began the moment I stopped trying to prove I deserved a place at a table. My seat had always come with a price. It began when I let the phone stay quiet and did not mistake that silence for rejection. It began when I understood that boundaries do not destroy real love. They only expose the love that was surviving on access. So if you have been the dependable one, the fixer, the emergency contact, the person everyone praises while quietly draining, I hope you hear this. You are allowed to close the road. You are allowed to stop paying emotional tolls to people who never plan to meet you halfway, and the ones who truly love you will not need ownership papers to know you matter. If this story spoke to something you have lived through, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and tell me where you are watching from. More importantly, tell me this. What was the moment you finally stopped paying to be loved?